Let us begin again. Here's what we have decided to do with the schedule. I conferred with Professor Sudarshan about this, because it always takes a long time for people to present anything, even if it's supposedly small. It just ends up ballooning. I've learned over the years to allow a lot of time, for student presentations in my own classes, and even then I never seem to have enough time. So what we've decided to do, well, today, because also I had scheduled that I would talk about the work I'm doing currently on the Hearing Voices movement and this thing called open dialogue, that I will talk about that during the second half. also to conform to Gyan guidelines, because they'll want some recorded part of today's session. And for the next class, we decided we'll just cut this activity. We'll just get rid of it, okay? Because we decided it's kind of redundant in a way. It's similar to what you did in writing your observations, and we can tell that many of you have been doing field work and know about writing field notes. So this is probably too simple an exercise, and maybe we can use that time, second half of tomorrow, to talk about what you learned from your interviews, okay? So we'll just shift the interview discussion to tomorrow, second half of class. And for those interviews, I mean, someone was discussing, this morning, it's like, kind of a personal topic to interview people that you maybe are just getting to know. Maybe think about it as, it's not, you're not meant to, maybe this wasn't clear from our prompt. You're not, it says on romantic relationships. Maybe we should have said on their opinions about romantic relationships, so you don't necessarily have to divulge your secrets to your classmate, but you can talk about, your ideas, your beliefs, what do you think about arranged marriage versus love marriage? Or is that an artificial dichotomy, which I think is what it actually is? There's a lot of critique yet to be made of that dichotomy. Okay, so that's how we'll move forward. So let me shift to telling you about some of this research that I've been working on. I'm going to include my own work in the last few sessions. You'll have one article that I wrote based on my last field work in Kerala for tomorrow, and we'll talk about one other piece I wrote on Saturday. But now I'll jump from the work I've done in Kerala to the work I'm doing now in the U.S. So now I think it's actually very interesting for me to do work in the U.S. after having been able to get to understand Kerala as a different culture, but one that I have become more familiar with. In a way, becoming familiar with a different culture enables you to exoticize your own culture, and deconstruct your own culture. Because whatever you grow up with is just obvious to you. It just seems natural and normal. But you want to unlearn. If you're trying to learn, anthropology, you're trying to learn some insights about humans and culture. I think it's very powerful if you can learn how to see what you took as normal to be arbitrary and constructed and not natural and universal. But of course, the topic I've chosen to look at in the U.S. is in a way kind of a fringe topic. It's not like I'm looking at mainstream U.S. culture, but it has forced me to do actually more reading on the U.S. in recent years. So I'll speak about my work on the Hearing Voices movement and open dialogue, but I also have done work on eugenics in the U.S., because the U.S. actually has a very profound history of eugenics, racial manipulation through the genome, Nazi Germany is the most famous example of eugenics, of course, but I just stumbled upon a discovery several years ago about how the place where I grew up in California and Stanford University, where I went as an undergraduate, was actually a center of eugenic research in the early 20th century. And I learned about this through reading STS, Science and Technology Studies, and so I decided I want to pursue that story. Let me learn more about, it's not well known, Stanford University's role in eugenics, and so that's a separate thing. So I've been working on these 2 US-based projects. It's caused me to learn a lot more about US history and a culture that to me, had seemed more natural and obvious. And this work I've done on the Hearing Voices movement also is not only, it's not only on the Hearing Voices movement, it's also on something called open dialogue. And it has brought, it has allowed me to do research in the US, but also it brought me to Scandinavia. I did a training in open dialogue in Finland, which is where open dialogue began. And for those of you working in mental health, you might be interested in hearing about some of these methods, which I think have a lot of great possibilities. Something else to mention about research methods, and how you choose your research, is the practicalities of your job and your life in your time. In many ways, I don't know if it works out the same exactly in the Indian academic system, but in the US, many of us realize that our main opportunity to really do in-depth research was during our PhD dissertation. For many of us, we get jobs, especially if you're in an underfunded public university like I am, where you end up with a heavy course load, you have so many committee duties and other things that you just don't ever have the time. I mean, we do once every 7 years, we have sabbatical leave and we can go do some research project. And I've done, I was 10 months in India, 2013, 2014 on a Fulbright grant. So but that was the last time, since 1997, I really had an extended, the research I did on patents was in bits and pieces, like I had in-house summer travel money that I got from my university. And I didn't have any leave from teaching, but I was able to go during the summer months between the semesters to come for like 1 month here to India, another month, to Hyderabad a year later. And then the next summer going to California to talk with Gilead Pharmaceutical Company. So I was only able to do slow bits and pieces research. It's not the ideal ethnographically, but you also have to work with what you can work with. Also working in the US, the more recent sabbatical leave I was able to get, it's a long story, but I had to do it one spring semester, and then the fall semester I was teaching, and the following spring semester I had another sabbatical. So I had to split it up with 1 semester in the middle, which makes it easier to do things locally if you have to do that schedule. And then it was my daughter's senior year in high school. I didn't want to go run off to India for a year while she's applying to colleges. So things like that will also affect your ability to do extensive field work. That's actually a very common issue. So your job, the leave time you get, your life can affect the idea of in-depth ethnographic research. And sometimes you have to be improvisational and figure out how to cobble together a research project. And for my research on the Hearing Voices movement also, I found it was difficult to do participant observation because this was not like a group of people that met in a place or hung out in a particular location. The Hearing Voices movement, I'll tell you more about it, but briefly, it's a system where people who hear voices, who may or may not have psychotic diagnoses, most of them do, help other voice hearers manage their voices as an alternative to psychiatry, as an alternative to medication. I mean, most people I met have tried the medication that didn't solve their problems. They found more success with the Hearing Voices movement. But it's not like a group, you know, that meets somewhere. And I think because of the way our culture is now, you know, both India and the US, but maybe the US more so, people are doing so many things online. You know, you say, oh, I say to this, there's a group in, you know, I'm in New York, there's a group in Massachusetts that does Hearing Voices groups and many other things, and they're very interesting. And I'm happy to drive 2.5 hours each way to go meet them because I want to do ethnography, and they're like, oh, no, you don't need to do that, we'll just talk on the phone. And it's difficult to convince people that, yes, this is actually part of my research method that I want to do. Also, when I was trying to find subjects to interview for this project, a person who's very important in the Hearing Voices movement and who sends out a newsletter to a listserv, Hearing Voices newsletter. She very kindly included a blurb about my research in the newsletter and said, if you're interested in participating, they should contact me. And so I got inquiries from all over the country, which was great, but also it meant that I could really only do those interviews on Zoom. I wasn't going to say no because it's an online platform. I mean, I really wanted to prioritize in person. So I think online interviews can be okay, but there has to be a justification. Like people were reaching out. I was talking about this with one of you, maybe with you recently. I received an article to review for a journal, and it was based on, I forget the theme, something psychological, cultural, based on interviews with middle-class women in India, all done remotely from outside India. And the person did not go to India for this article. So to me, that's just, I don't know, that's misuse of online technologies. I mean, I suppose you can still get something out of that, but the journal it was submitted to emphasizes ethnography, and I just said in my review comments, some interesting insights here, but if the person never stepped foot in India, I mean, maybe they did in the past in their research, I don't know, but it's just not an ethnographically useful thing to do. So that to me it was, I don't know what it is, Zoom as a way of laziness, way of getting out of having to do the hard work of traveling, or whatever the motivation was, I don't know. But if you have some reason, like I'm not going to turn down, but then as I had many opportunities to speak on Zoom, then I pushed harder to get more in-person interviews. I just became more insistent, and I became more explicit for many people. Like, why would I go to all the difficulty, spend half the day traveling just for this one interview, when in their minds I could just do several in a row on Zoom. But I would say, well, it's part of my research methods for my field. It really, my research will have more credibility by doing work in person, and many of them accepted that. But it really had to be someone I couldn't go across the country 2,000 miles for that, but I could go within a certain radius of where I was in New York. But then also, that's just interviews. I was thinking, what about the participant observation? How do I do that? They don't hang out, the Hearing Voices people don't hang out anywhere. But so one thing I did do, because I'm on several listservs, including for this organization, which you should also all know about. I heard about a Hearing Voices training that was being done in Boston, so I signed up for that. And I went to Boston and I did the training with these two women who lead Hearing Voices groups, and they're both voice hearers. And I spent like 4 days being trained in using their hearing voices methods. That was a part of participant observation. I saw that opportunity. I said, aha, I'll do that, and I can claim I did more than interviewing. And that was a very interesting, eye-opening experience. I spent 4 days in the seminars. I was the one academic. Everybody else, worked in mental health care or homeless outreach or something related to their work. I was really the academic, ethnographic interloper, observing, both learning the method, but observing, and if I wasn't going to use it as a mental health professional, but I was going to be able to write in a more informed way about the Hearing Voices movement. But even then, I've been looking for other opportunities. Like, how else do I, just hang out with these people and get to know them more in depth? I mean, you can do an individual interview. That's very useful. In ethnography, anthropology, we often like to have follow-up interviews with the same person, get to know them over time. Also, practically kind of difficult. So, but another way I was able to do a form of participant observation for this was by going to these conferences. So this group, the International Society for Psychological and Social Approaches to Psychosis, is very much connected with people doing the Hearing Voices movement, open dialogue, alternatives to suicide, soteria houses. There's all these programs, and this group is very central to this. And so by going to their conferences, not really, I have presented my research at their conferences, but I was going not as an academic presenter, but as a participant observer. So I went to ISPS International Conference last year, was in Finland, in Helsinki. So I went to that, and I mean, I was able to see one person I interviewed for my research in the US. She gave a keynote address at the conference. Another person I interviewed in the US, she came to see me give a talk about my work on hearing voices, and she gave me feedback. In fact, then I sat with her on the bus as we went off to conference dinner, and I was able to chat with her. She did a training session for me, with me in Boston. So by going to the conference, I was able to get more interaction. And in fact, I'm planning to go, trying to find funding to go to the International Hearing Voices Congress, which happens every year. This year it's in the Czech Republic, in Prague. And so again, as participant observation, not as academic doing a paper, just hoping to hang out with and have informal conversations with people from that. So I mean, this is the only place, these are only places where you can kind of just mingle with people from these groups through these professional organizations. So that's been my method. It's been improvisational in many ways. And so let me go through some of these slides, and I can talk more about some of the findings I've had in this research.
Professor, I didn't get it, like why you mentioned the second case experiment.
Oh, this group?
Three things you mentioned about this slide.
Okay. Let me just go to the slideshow mode. This you're asking about? Yeah. So this slide is just basically to point out this group, ISPS. This is just a screenshot from their website, from their main website. I think, was it the international? Actually, it's ISPS US, so it's from the US chapter. I just wanted to highlight a few things that they present. So this idea that there's more to psychosis care than meds and beds. No one is just a diagnosis. Healing isn't just personal, it's social. So ISPS is a group of mostly mental health practitioners, but also a few academics and some people who do a little bit of both. And this is very important, people with lived experience. That's their term for people who have had experiences of psychosis. They avoid using the word patient because they don't want to reduce the person to this biomedical kind of subject. They want to sort of emphasize their full humanity. And so you'll hear terms like people with lived experience or voice hearer, or some people call themselves psychiatric survivors, all kinds of different names. Like I think that's what also Bhargavi Dawar called herself, right? Bhargavi Dawar? Yeah, she also called, she has very similar perspective from India, an anti-psychiatry activist, psychiatrist, from Pune, who Vasudeva knew. She passed away recently. So you have these different groups that all come to the meetings and other events that ISPS, which I thought was very, very interesting, very different from other professional organizations. I go to American Anthropological Association meetings, or I've been to some South Asia scholar conferences, and it's always just the scholars that are there. At ISPS conferences, you'll have people who their qualification is their lived experience, and they'll be giving papers as well, and they'll even give keynote addresses, and they'll even lead groups. In fact, the last president of the ISPS US chapter is a voice hearer herself, and she's written a memoir about her experience. So she ran the organization for a while, and the current executive director is a voice hearer herself. And not that you would know these things; they divulged this to you, but your impression is that they're just very interesting, dynamic professionals. So, and there's an India branch to this group. Though there's a little problem with that. I've know several people in India who've been interested, including Sudarshan, in maybe connecting with this group, but the person in charge of it hasn't been doing much, and is difficult to contact. So, hopefully someone else can take up the India chapter and get it going. But anybody from India can also join the international group. There's ISPS, there's the International Society for Psychological and Social Approaches to Psychosis, has branches of different countries, but then there's also the international group of it, which is sort of anybody from any country can join at that level. Yeah.
The persons who are experiencing this, they come to these conferences and present their life. How do these people get selected? Is there someone assessing their insight and saying they have a level of, in terms of their psychotic condition?
Yeah.
Someone decides and then.
It's really just like any other conference. So somebody, I guess I don't know, because I don't know the inner workings of how they select who's the keynote speaker and who's, but just like many other conferences, people will submit a proposal for a paper, and the committee that reviews the proposals will choose. And sometimes they'll invite somebody. Sometimes there's actually like what you might call famous voice hearers. Some have like given TED Talks about their experience, and so they may actually be invited because they're well known. There's last meeting I went to, there was a person who is a voice hearer, but he also works for an NGO, with outreach to people with mental health issues, and he has become sort of notable in his community, and so he was invited to give keynote address. So they use different criteria to decide who they want to bring in. And at the international meetings, there's always a few people from India. There's also always a few people coming directly from India. There's also a few Indian or South Asian scholars working on South Asia, but they're based in universities in Canada or Europe or something like that, and they're presenting at the meetings about some research they've done in India. So look them up, consider, anybody who's interested in mental health, particularly from a social angle, who is skeptical about the reduction of mental health to simple, chemical processes in the biomedical model, anybody like that, may be interested in this group. So let me say a few more words about what I found in this research. I've so far, I mean, one thing I need to do this summer, and I really need to start doing this while I'm in India, because I start to teach, at the end of August, is to really write, something for publication on this work. I'm just finishing transcribing the interviews, which is, taken a long time because, again, my schedule, I had time off to do the interviews, but then I'm teaching full time with all the other things, and transcription is a burdensome, time-consuming thing. So, but I have done at least this presentation on this, and I chose to speak about the shamans among us. So there's a classic discussion in anthropology about whether a psychotic person might have been a shaman or some other kind of, guru, spiritual leader in some other kind of society. Usually the idea is, some non-Western culture, some quote unquote traditional, which is a, problematic term, but that's how people often imagine that's where the shaman is. What that actually is hard to specify. Many of us say, well, really, maybe we're referring to like pre-capitalist, non-capitalist, non-modern cultures. But of course, where do you find that today anywhere? Capitalism is, enmeshed in every place. But there's this idea that there was a sort of a natural, that this unusual, voice hearing, hearing the gods in the head is some kind of natural human capacity that has been pathologized with modernity, with the modern scientific perspective, and psychiatry can only understand this as some kind of pathology. And the opinions about this view, I would say there's no clear consensus. I mean, there are those who say, yeah, sure, it looks like these characteristics may have had a social role in the past, and others that say, oh, you're romanticizing psychopathology. Those people were also considered crazy, in those local societies. I mean, I think that perhaps both things are true, that actually that maybe there was a social role. I'm convinced of that more and more by meeting people in the Hearing Voices movement today. Maybe in some earlier societies, the psychotic person had some gift. But it also seems that everywhere, there is terminology for craziness, there's vocabulary, brand, right, in Malayalam. There's traditional terms for the crazy person that's not the shaman, there's, that's a topic, is the psychotic person a shaman? And, I would say the answer is maybe. That's what we've decided. But there are some people I met in my Hearing Voices research that I would say, in the modern capitalist society I've been working, are like the shaman, for whom voice hearing really was never a problem. It was a challenge, they said, but these few individuals, they were never hospitalized, never had any real setbacks, and they have been able to become healers themselves, like the shaman, supposedly, right? The shaman ideally has this, what we today call a mental breakdown. They may see it as a spiritual crisis, and they're often able to, though, overcome this or get through it, and with that they have the gift of healing afterwards, and they're able to heal others. You see that in, to go back to Obiasekere's ethnography, Medusa's hair. Many of the women in Sri Lanka that he profiles end up being healers after having this spiritual crisis. So that's that is a phase, a trajectory that does happen in the world. Maybe not to everybody who has this crisis. And some people have that today. They don't need to live in a non-modern, non-capitalist society, but they may have difficulty finding their way. So a little bit about the hearing voices movement. So there's a variety of voice hearers. If you're introduced to the hearing voices movement, that's one thing they'll emphasize. Actually, one thing that so hearing voices is a continuum from something that may just happen one time to, 2 episodes in your lifetime, to something that is everyday, oppressive condition that is a torment. And not all voice hearers end up with a diagnosis of psychosis. In fact, in psychiatry, hopefully I'm correct, that hearing voices itself does not result in any, it's only when it's coupled with other problems. And some people I met have heard voices and seen mental health professionals, and they had no diagnosis of psychosis because there really wasn't any other problem. They were functional with their lives, and it didn't seem to impair them in any significant way. But most of them end up with a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia or psychosis not otherwise specified or something like that, and most of them have ended up in involuntary hospitalization in the mental hospital. So that's most of the people I met, but it's a variety of experience.
Sir,
Yeah,
just to clarify,
yeah.
is hearing voices like what mainstream psychiatry terminology would call auditory hallucination? Is that
Yes, yeah, right, yeah. And it's not just voices, as the term auditory, it can be sounds too as well. And they can have visual hallucinations as well, and I'll just bracket that off because that's not what but some of these people also have that as well. And, mhm.
So, like, if I could add to the question,
Yeah.
so if I understood it right, these are a subset of people who only hear voices, they do not have other things like delusions and all which are used to diagnose paranoid schizophrenia or acute onset psychosis.
Right, no, the people I interviewed, most of them had diagnosis of psychosis and many problems, and were involuntarily, I'm just pointing out that some people, actually a small number I met, never had a diagnosis, but most of them did. Most of the people I interviewed did end up having a diagnosis of psychosis and have been hospitalized multiple times. That's the more typical. And also, they claim that studies show that voice hearing is as common as left-handedness or as common as being gay, that it's like 1 out of every 10 people. So there's probably, 2 or 3 of us in the class, that again can be just something that is a one-off thing that's never an issue. Researchers also say, that there's voice hearing that doesn't even count, like on the edge of sleep. You can sometimes hear, in that semi-conscious state here, you think it's an audible voice, but it's sort of an edge of sleep experience that's kind of normal, voice hearing. So there's a range of voices. And so peer-led groups, the key thing in the hearing voices movement is that it's voice hearers helping other voice hearers deal with their issues. And generally the voice hearers who are the group facilitators are people who have had some success in managing their relationship to voices. Many of the people I interviewed said that, the psychiatric system is to get rid of the voices through medication. The people from the hearing voices movement say that didn't work. But instead their goal is to change their relationships to their voices, improve the relationship. So instead of getting rid of the voices, they find it's actually more helpful to improve the relations to them, to get to know them. And also the psychiatric view, as they see it, is just to get rid of them, that they're meaningless, they just need to be dismissed. But people in the hearing voices movement feel like they need to understand the voices. Why are they there? Why are they saying what they're saying? They also feel some of them need to just get rid of. You hear all kinds of encounters. So far this is I've talked about methods. and participant observation at the conferences, doing a training. I'll move on from that. I have some, let me just see, how are we doing on time? Maybe I'll skip through the literature that I'm mentioning, just for the sake of time. I'm quoting Janice Jenkins, by the way, is probably one of the best known anthropologists who works with people with psychosis. And she did this edited volume. Wait, is that an edited volume? Yeah, I should have cited it, her as the editor also of that volume, Schizophrenia, Culture, and Subjectivity. Tanya Luhrmann, who is one of the co-authors here, is I would say the other anthropologist who is very well known for her work on people with psychosis. And she's worked in the US and she's worked in Africa and in India. And she's done work in India. It seems to me like actually very brief visits really, but she's gone to Chennai and worked with people at SCARF, which some of you may know of. And this actually, she has a great article with this, she co-authored with a psychiatrist called Dr. Padmavati, who is at SCARF, in which they discuss a quote-unquote patient or a person with psychosis that people from SCARF have interacted. She's a housewife in Chennai. She hears voices. She speaks to God in her head. But she's never been hospitalized, mainly because, one of Tanya Luhrmann's points is because in Tamil Nadu, it's actually just more acceptable to hear God, and that her family was supportive of that. In fact, apparently her father was, the message he gave was that, oh, she is a gift, that she hears God, and she's able to she's functional in terms of her family role. This experience is not in any way made her incapable of fulfilling her social role. So she just continued. And the suggestion is by Tanya Luhrmann is if she was in the US, she'd more likely be hospitalized. Mm-hmm.
So, sir, the participants that you interviewed, do you think because even when we do mental status examination in clinical settings, insight is very subjective to the clinician, and the clinician decides the level of insight that the patient has. So do you feel insight of having auditory hallucinations with people who have that insight, and with people who don't have that insight that they have been having these hallucinations? For example, you considered Tamil Nadu as an example where it is culturally accepted, so there might be a gray area of insight. Yeah. So how do you see insight with relevance to this?
Well, that's a good question. I'd have to think about it more to give a good answer, but I think that this makes me realize, I think it depends on which perspective of insight is coming. The biomedical perspective is like, are you aware that you're crazy? Are you aware that you have a DSM diagnosis, and do you accept that as insight? But the hearing voices people would think of insight very differently. Of course, I'm putting words in their mouth, and I'm, don't know what they would say, but they would probably, insight would be something like the awareness of your voices and what they are and how to cope with them that you might learn from experience. And then I don't know, the Tamil situation is different. Insight is really muddied by that, because here we have a situation where somebody might say that this Tamil housewife maybe doesn't have insight because she thinks she's talking to God and she doesn't realize she has psychosis. But is that relevant when many people believe her? and it's not a problem necessarily for her. Anyway, I'm going into detail about the example from her work. In this work, this is based on some research she did with I believe it's a psychologist, and I forget the other co-author. And they worked in Ghana in West Africa, And based on their research, they say that the shaman and schizophrenia are revisited. So it recently bringing back, they review the literature of that discussion. And they talk about these priests in Ghana, and they say that religious experts have some religious experts have a schizophrenia-like process, which is managed or mitigated by religious practice so that individuals are able to function effectively and are not identified by others in the community as ill. We suggest the practice of the faith in their training and apprenticeship may diminish the negative voices so characteristic of schizophrenia and enable the individual to develop reasonable relationships with other voices that come to be experienced as positive. Well, that last sentence describes exactly what the people in the Hearing Voices movement do. They diminish the negative voices and they develop reasonable relationships with other voices. So I felt like what the priests in Ghana were doing is similar to, and Ghana is where we go to find the shaman normally. But I felt like I'm finding people doing the same thing in modern capitalist northeastern US. And by the way, an example, Hearing Voices is a long known thing in cultures throughout the world. This is a painting in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City of Joan of Arc, sort of the national icon of France, who, whose visions led to the defeat of the British. Her voice hearing, became the source of victory for the French nation. And in this painting, she's hearing the voices of several saints. You can see them sort of barely visible off to the left, hovering behind her. So this was we might say not a cultural situation as much as a historical situation. So, in France today, if you say, well, Saint Michael has been talking to me and we should do this, your health would be questioned. But when Joan of Arc did this hundreds of years ago, the reaction was quite different.
Sir, is it like she was in the 100 years of war for British and France, so she was helping for the France, right? But her justice was denied, and later she was also, burned and in the road, in the middle of the road. And was it because she's hearing this voice, or
No,
was
right.
it or something?
Actually, that's a good question. I've heard the story, but I forget, why she eventually is burned as it's not because she hears voices, but it had to do with something else. I don't remember exactly. Some incorrect religious claim that challenged the religious authorities of the time. But the experience of voice hearing is not what was in question in her life.
Sir, the French burned her or the English burned her?
I think the French. Yeah. So leaping to the present, the Hearing Voices movement reaches out to people through several methods, including putting up these flyers, where you can tear off a little tab with a hard to read phone number. It says Hearing Voices Group, and it gives an address and a phone number of where they meet. So, and then it's also telling you about, you can tear off the piece, but it just tells you about a general meeting time. So providing outreach that way. I'm not sure where they put this flyer, some public space. Some of this material I'm presenting comes from the Wildflower Alliance. That's the name of an NGO in Holyoke, Massachusetts. So this is in Western Massachusetts. The Wildflower Alliance is also where the people who did the Hearing Voices training I did came from as well. And these are materials from their training that I took. So the Wildflower Alliance training encourages, they have this method called VCVC, which stands for Validation, Curiosity, Vulnerability, and Community. And just for the sake of time, I won't go into depth about what that means, but these are things that you're supposed to exhibit towards the voice hearer to help them progress towards interacting with the group. Like validation's they had us do exercises in validation. You know, somebody says that they have to, you know, save the children in the neighborhood from some evil forces, you know, and you're supposed to say, you're not supposed to say, oh, really, why do you think you have to, you're supposed to say something like, oh, wow, that must be very stressful. You know, like how do you do that? You know, what is, you know, and so you're supposed to validate, you know, and you're supposed to show curiosity and vulnerability. You might say, I would find that really difficult. And community, you know, I'll just move on though for the. Let me give you some examples from people I interviewed that represented a variety of different sort of approaches, ways of coping with voice hearing. So this is, you know, these are all pseudonyms. I just make up some name for them. That's what you should also all do. I don't know if that's always required from IRB reviews, but you know, creating a pseudonym and letting your informant know that you're doing that before you engage with them, you know, is very reassuring. And, you know, it's not 100% insurance that no one will know that their story ever gets, you know, connected to them. So there's some information on him, who he is. I'm not going to just repeat everything that's on the slide, but a little bit about his life. You know, Michael's father killed himself in front of his mother when Michael was 12. His mother became incapable of taking care of him, so his brother took over parenting and beat him. 3 years later, after the deaths and his mother kind of checking out and beating by his brother, his best friend died, and then voice hearing and encounters with psychiatry began. I mean, for most people I interviewed, it was something like this. I mean, there's some traumatic experience that was the beginning of this. And just a quote from my interview with him, the thing that really helped me about the Hearing Voices Network. So this is a very short recounting of a story in the form of bullet points. But, you know, encounters with psychiatry began, meaning he was hospitalized multiple times. This was years ago, you know, in Texas. Now he's 42 years old. He's living in another part of the country, and he's gotten involved with hearing voices groups and other approaches. He's read a lot. He's got a lot of different interesting perspectives. He's really into philosophy, really fascinating person to speak with, actually, I found. And he said that what really helped him about Hearing Voices Network was just having relationships with people who had suffered similarly, who understood what I was going through. That is the main thing. That it is so simple, in a way. Hearing Voices groups, like you meet other people who've had the same experience. Many people, no, I'm sure most people, overwhelming majority, I'm sure, people who have a voice hearing experience think that they're alone. I'm this unique, crazy person, and the encounter with the mental health professionals is also a feeling of like increasing stigmatization and labeling, and I even feel like more of a freak. But when you're in a group of people who all had the same experience and you're sharing your experiences with each other, it's just very reassuring, like, oh, I'm not the only one experiencing this. And that's one basic thing that many people told me. So he's elaborating on that at the bottom. Being around people who've experienced stuff and were at different stages in the recovery process was just really affirming. Like, oh my God, I've escaped the bubble of psychiatric bullshit, of conventional bullshit, and now I'm having a real mutual, old, genuine relationship with another person who's experienced similar things and knows what I'm talking about, and vice versa. And he has something called a Wellness Recovery Action Plan, or WRAP, that it's another one of these various methods ISPS people are into. He said, so as I was asking him, you know, what he does with, well, I'll skip that just to be quick. He was explaining how he copes with what feels like the beginning of another psychotic breaks. He says, my friends from these different groups, but all of them familiar with the concept of mutual aid, know that if we get a text message from Michael saying that Michael is acting weird, we need to go to his apartment and follow the things in his RAP plan. You know, and I actually made a wellness recovery action plan. If I'm at this stage, if it's early enough, give me an Ativan, have me do simple math, have me do grounding stuff. Maybe that'll mean I can sleep it off and not have to go to the hospital. He actually says math is very grounding for him when he's beginning to have one of these he's developed this action plan for himself, and his friends know what to do, okay? And he elaborated this, very practical aspect of this, like, if I go to the hospital, it messes up my work for 4 weeks, it causes all kinds of problems, but if I do this, usually next day I'm okay. And so this works for him. I love this other quote. It's not just the anthropologists. Many people have heard the shaman theory, okay? I grew up with a lot of, if you were in Africa, you would be a shaman. But I'm still going to the hospital where they're about to beat the shit out of me. He reports having been beaten by staff in the hospital in Texas. He explained where he is now, Washington State, that they treat him very well. But he did have that experience. Michael is a person who has this way of coping. He's not a shaman. He's a teacher and a writer, and he's got a system. So Teresa was different. Yeah.
Michael is acting giver, so they get a text message. So there is always some caregiver who's involved in the program who actually messages the other members.
Yeah. No, Michael messages them. Himself. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I mean, he's phrasing it as if, he says if they get a message saying Michael, he means the message will come from himself. So he has like maybe a little group text on his phone. Maybe it's listed under RAP in his messages or whatever he's using, but he's sending that message. I think he's aware of the signs of this process, and so he knows, this is happening. Let me send this to my group. So Teresa was really interesting. She was very compelling. She was very unique. I mean, she was the one person like this. So this is not like the normal experience. She's, as I describe her, 30-year-old white middle-class woman, MA in clinical psychology and education. She has been hearing voices, she says, since age 3, but it got more intense after nearly dying from an illness at age 8. Though her parents, as she says here, or as I paraphrase here, unlike a lot of other parents, they responded to her voice hearing with curiosity rather than fear. Many parents like, what is happening? I better call. Suddenly people are at the house taking the kid away. They're like, oh my God, what's happening to me? And so they were supportive and curious. They did not pathologize her experience. They did, try different healers, and she found Reiki to be very helpful to her. And she never encountered the mental health system, was never on psychotic medications. Most people, not most people, 90% of people I interviewed were on psychotic medication, psychiatric medications. She did do some psychoanalysis in Reiki. Those were 2 things that she did. And this is an excerpt from my interview with her. She used the metaphor of cracking open, which other people use too. So she's saying in the middle of the conversation, probably cracking open, dying, cracked me open. My psyche probably cracked in a pretty extreme way from that, like when she was 8 and she almost died. And I tell her, cracked open is a metaphor a lot of people I spoke to have used. Maybe for you, it was a near-death experience that was the trauma. So people, you heard about Michael's trauma. That was more typical. And a few people said that they felt like the trauma cracked their mind open and opened them to a different layer of a reality. So she's reporting the same thing, but not from a trauma like a violent abuse by somebody who's supposed to care about her, but just something more, innocent, as it were, an illness coming from, nature, God, or whatever. And so, she responds, yes, that, for her, that's the trauma. And I mentioned that one person I interviewed was explaining it like, extreme experiences that can be trauma push you into this place where it's like this new thing pops open in your mind, as I just described, she affirms. Arguably I'm leading her, but I'm reporting what other people have told me who have had similar experiences. And and again, I'm paraphrasing what other people have said about accessing a different reality, and she said, I resonate with that. That's exactly how I would have described the experience. As I was cracked open and I got an extension of my experience. And it was unseen to the naked eye, but very visceral for me. She generally thinks, the way she describes her own experience is in terms of energy and how energy moves in her body. She's very spatial in her descriptions with her hands when she explains the experience of psychosis and voice hearing and how to work with it. And Reiki has informed her perspective on that. So her voices were never, like I said, they weren't exactly a problem. They weren't a plague like they were for some people. She says that voices were asking her for help, which she found stressful. And then she felt that she had a gift as a healer, and she refers to that, and working with people who had dementia, who she felt she could connect to in some sort of felt sense energy level rather than a cognitive level. And another quote from her from my interview, I never want to give voice hearing a bad rap. I always want to say it's extremely challenging and definitely impacts functioning, for sure. Like it'll impact my functioning, and sometimes it'll be very supportive and aligned or neutral, like I won't be having a negative experience and it's okay. So her point is that it's challenging, but not a pathology for her. So we're almost out of time, and maybe I'll just mention this person is very interesting. He was similar to Teresa, again, and in that sense also an exception. He was not like most people I got to know. His story is too long to explain in 5 minutes. He recalls what the voices told him in certain episodes. He experienced abuse and had a very horrible, trauma when he was a child. His baby brother was killed by his father, who was an alcoholic, and he witnessed this. But he also is partly Native American, and he described his relationship with a grandmother who was still very connected to her Native American culture, and who saw his experience hearing voices as a natural gift. And he was able to tap into that non-pathologizing view, which he found very empowering. And he spoke to elders from his tribe who also confirmed, saw his voice hearing as channeling the divine. And so he didn't start off on a path of pathology and did not encounter the mental health field in his experience. So he had that. I would say Teresa had the sort of non-persecutory, betrayal of experience of trauma, but rather an illness experience in support of parents. William had this cultural understanding of voice hearing he was able to tap into. And this is one of the lines from the interview. So after talking, he talked like hour and a half, almost without interruption, and said, so those are a few things about me, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with me, by the way. Sorry? Oh, so yeah, I'm sorry, I guess I glossed over that, but he actually uses equine therapy where he works with horses, with veterans who are suicidal. So that he sort of became a healer in that ways. And he describes it to me, I mean, I don't completely understand it myself. But you work with horses. I mean, he's experienced with horses already, but he uses horses therapeutically, where he'll take a veteran. He has a really interesting story. Sorry?
They take care of these cow take care of horses, that kind of.
Yeah, right. Actually, he'll have work with a veteran. The veteran will say, they'll stand among the horses. After a while, he says describes 3 horses left. One continued to stand by him, and he says this horse is empathetic to you. He's understanding you're having some trouble, and so it's therapy through horse relationships. Okay, I'll just say that much.
Animal-assisted therapy.
Sorry?
Animal-assisted therapy.
Animalistic therapy? Okay, is that a thing? A label? I haven't heard. Okay.
It is a type of therapy
Okay.
where you use animals as your comfort caregivers. So I think.
Okay, in this place, actually, Snehavita in Trivandrum, where I did research in the past, a psychosocial rehabilitation center had used animals, not horses, but other animals, as part of their therapy.
There's also the connection because he's a Native American. There is the Native Americans have this thing with horses where they have the bonding thing.
Yeah.
There is a thing where
Right.
Native Americans find horses to be their partners, healers,
Yeah, that's true. That exists. I mean, I would say probably most Native Americans are not tapped into that actual thing, but he is a person who did, have developed that relationship. And he described his own history of horse, what do they call it? Horse whispering, which is what you call the relationship to horses that you develop, and how it was different from the sort of white people's horse whispering methods. He has Native American horse whispering methods he described. So just pushing on for the sake of time. This is actually a New York Times profile of Carolyn Mazel Carlton. That's her real name. I'm using that because she's a public figure and is public, but that's how it works also. Pseudonyms, if it's private, it's just for your research. If stories are publicly known, then you use their real name. So she was one of the people who did the training I took in the Hearing Voices methods, and she's actually, I won't tell you her story now. I could tell you some later. It's a fascinating story, and it's very moving. And she actually got profiled. Doctors gave her antipsychotics. She decided to live with her voices. Anyway, one of my takeaways is that ultimately these 2 individuals I mentioned are like the shaman, okay? They went through this crisis. It did not end up being pathologized, and they found a way forward as a healer using what they've learned to help other people, okay? That's just 2 people, out of many that I interviewed. Some, like the first person I showed you, Michael, found a way to cope, but they're not a shaman. So arguably the shaman can also happen in modern capitalist society, but it's the exception. Most of these people ended up with really painful stories of multiple forced hospitalizations and ended up generally in a better place. And I don't know, maybe it's harder to become the shaman with so many off-ramps into other ways of understanding your experience. I mean, for William, to have this Native American connection that was really real and vibrant. I mean, most Native American, I'm partially Native American, but have really no connection to that culture in my experience. So he's an exception that he was able to tap into that. So that's a few insights from my current work ongoing. I didn't mention the work on open dialogue, just for the sake of time. But maybe I'll just point out this website. Open dialogue is another method that directly involves mental health professionals as well. And this is an anthropologist and others using qualitative methods, evaluating the implementation of open dialogue in the UK's National Health Service, which is doing a clinical trial of open dialogue, and the results of that trial should be published soon. It'll be interesting to see how that comes out. So I suppose it's time to break for lunch. So tomorrow we have two readings. One of my articles based on my work in Kerala, another article based on work in the U.S. And my article is supposed to be an effort to be multidisciplinary. In that article, I was trying to speak to an audience of mental health professionals using mixed methods. And again, the second half of class, you guys will be talking about reporting on your interviewing experience, basically what you learned from your interviewing experience then.